The coach wheels thundered over the rutted trail, each jolt shaking Clara Whitfield's fragile hopes. Dust pressed against the window glass, coating her gloves and bonnet in a fine red powder. She clutched the folded letter in her lap as though it were scripture itself, her lifeline and proof that she belonged to someone, somewhere, out here in this unforgiving stretch of wilderness. She whispered the address inside her mind until it became prayer. The air smelled of sage and sunburnt soil, and though she told herself not to tremble, her hands betrayed her. The coach rattled to a halt before a wide, desolate spread of land. The ranch did not look like the promise on paper. No sweeping porch with white paint, no tidy barn, no neat corral. Only a weathered cabin hunched against the horizon, a sagging fence leaning as if exhausted. The driver muttered, "End of the line," and hoisted her trunk down with little ceremony. Clara stepped onto the hard-packed earth, her boots sinking in silence. The door creaked open. A man stood framed in its shadow, tall and broad, shoulders cut from work and hardship. His face carried lines too deep for his age, his jaw rough with days-old stubble, eyes sharp and suspicious. A scar rode the length of his cheek like an unfinished story. He took one look at her and frowned as though the sight of her arrival was insult enough. "You're lost," he said, voice gravel-edged. Clara stiffened, gripping her Bible tighter. "I'm Clara Whitfield. Sent by arrangement. This is the McGraw Ranch, is it not?" The man's stare darkened. "It is. But I didn't send for a bride." Her throat went dry. She unfolded the letter with fumbling fingers, pointing to the address, the ink smudged from travel. "This was the direction given me. I've come across half the continent. Surely there is some mistake." "There is," he snapped, stepping onto the porch. "And it's standing right in front of me." Humiliation burned her cheeks. She turned toward her trunk, ready to drag it back to the road, though the thought of miles of wilderness and no coach until next week nearly buckled her knees. She could not cry. Not here, not now. She bit down hard against the rising ache in her throat. Then came a tug at her skirts, so small and insistent it startled her. Clara looked down. A child, no taller than her waist, hair tangled, cheeks hollow from want, peered up with solemn eyes the color of storm clouds. The little girl whispered in a voice trembling but sure, "God finally sent you to us." Clara froze. Something inside her chest cracked open at those words, at the desperate faith clinging to them. The child's hand clung as though release meant abandonment. The man on the porch shifted uneasily, glancing between them as if caught in a storm he could neither fight nor flee. "You'd best let her be, Annie," he muttered, though the authority in his voice faltered. "She doesn't belong here." The girl did not let go. Neither did Clara, though she had not realized she'd placed her own hand over the child's thin fingers. For the first time since leaving the East, Clara's heart stirred with something other than dread. Inside the cabin, supper was a meager affair of beans and black bread, eaten under silence thick as smoke. Elias McGraw, she had learned his name after much prodding, kept his gaze fixed on his plate, jaw clenching each time Annie spoke to Clara as though already adopting her. Clara tried to be gracious, tried to make light conversation, but her words sank like stones into the void between them. Afterward, Elias stood by the hearth, arms folded. "You'll leave on the next coach. I can't feed another mouth." Clara's spine straightened. Weariness tugged at her bones, but pride held her upright. "I will not abandon a child who asks for me." His eyes flared. "This is no place for you. You'll wither under it. Better to leave before the land eats you whole." "Perhaps," she said, voice low but steady. "But perhaps not. God has his reasons." For a long beat he held her gaze, something unreadable flickering behind the hardness, then he turned away with a bitter snort. Annie slipped her hand into Clara's once more, wordless, as if sealing a pact Elias could not undo. That night, Clara lay awake on a narrow cot, the cabin walls breathing with the sound of wind and coyote calls. Shadows twisted in the corners, whispering doubts, but Annie's words still echoed, "God finally sent you." She clung to them like an anchor, though she could not fathom why Providence would plant her in such barren soil. The first crack of gunfire shattered the night. Clara bolted upright, heart hammering. Outside, horses screamed, men's voices shouted, and the sharp report of a rifle cut through the dark. She rushed to the window. Lantern light flared at the edge of the fence line, shapes moving fast, too many to count. Elias's shout tore across the yard. "Stay inside! Keep Annie down!" Annie stirred, frightened, and Clara threw herself over the child, pressing her close as the walls quivered with violence outside. Fear clawed up her throat, but she bit it back. Every beat of her heart hammered one truth: she was not meant to run. Not now. Not tonight. The cabin filled with smoke from the rifle's echo, and the earth itself seemed to hold its breath. Whatever destiny had meant when it sent her to the wrong ranch, she knew only this: it had begun. The night did not surrender easily. Elias's rifle barked into the darkness, the sound cracking against the distant hills and scattering the coyotes into silence. Clara held Annie tight on the floorboards, feeling each recoil shake through the cabin walls. Every cry from outside made her flinch, yet Elias's silhouette in the window was unyielding, a man carved from the same stone that built this hard land. When at last the shadows melted back into the night, only the echo of hoofbeats remained. Elias kicked the door shut behind him, chest heaving, the acrid tang of powder clinging to his clothes. He looked at Clara crouched over Annie, her hair loose from its pins, her eyes wide but unbroken. Something in his face shifted then, softened almost imperceptibly, though he buried it beneath a growl. "They were testing the fences," he said. "They'll be back." Clara rose, her hands still trembling, but her voice firm. "Then you'll need help." Elias's laugh was harsh, humorless. "Help? You'd faint at the sight of blood." "Perhaps. But I will not faint at the sight of a child in danger." His jaw tightened, words caught in his throat. He turned away, pacing before the hearth as though the flames might burn the argument from his tongue. Annie crawled into Clara's lap, her trust wordless and complete, and Elias looked away from the sight as though it pained him. Morning revealed the damage: slashed fence posts, hoofprints carved deep in the soil, and a blood-red symbol daubed on the gate, crudely painted with some poor animal's life. Clara stared at it with a chill down her spine. Elias spat into the dirt and muttered, "A warning. They want me gone." She asked, "Who are they?" "Men with no law but hunger. Rustlers, drifters, worse. This land's too wild for comfort." Clara bent to pick up a piece of the broken fence. "Then it needs mending." She set to work without waiting for permission, her skirts catching on splinters, her gloves soon dirt-stained. Annie followed her with earnest determination, carrying nails in her small hands. Elias watched from the porch, arms folded, his expression unreadable. By noon Clara's back ached, yet she had found a rhythm: hammer, lift, hold, brace. She could feel Elias's gaze flickering toward her, though he never stepped down to help. At last, when she swayed from weariness, he grumbled, "You'll ruin your hands doing a man's work." "They're already ruined," she replied, showing him the blisters with a proud tilt of her chin. "But the fence stands straighter for it." A flicker of respect crossed his eyes, quickly smothered beneath the shadow of memory. Later, as they ate a thin stew inside, he spoke with a heaviness that seemed to drag each word. "My wife used to patch the fences with me. She died on this land. Took the fight right out of the place." Clara lowered her spoon, the silence pressing between them. She had not expected confession. She answered gently, "I lost my family to fever. There is no place left for me but forward." For the first time, his eyes lingered on her not with suspicion but with recognition, as though grief knew its kin. The days that followed were stitched together with labor and unease. Clara discovered she had more use than Elias had credited her for. She could mend torn shirts, tend the small patch of vegetables that had nearly given up under neglect, coax laughter from Annie when the girl's small shoulders sagged with sadness. One morning, she even attempted to milk the cow, a stubborn beast with horns sharp as judgment. After much struggling, the pail tipped, and she found herself drenched in warm froth while Annie laughed until tears streaked her cheeks. Clara laughed too, though Elias, leaning against the fence, only muttered, "Cows got more patience than most." Yet the corner of his mouth twitched, betraying amusement he did not care to admit. But the unease grew thicker as the nights lengthened. More marks appeared on the outskirts of the ranch, symbols carved into trees, a bloody rag tied to the corral. Elias cleaned his rifle with grim resolve, muttering that they were tightening the noose. Clara felt fear settle into her bones, but she would not let it take root in her heart. She prayed aloud when she worked, not for safety but for courage. One evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, Annie began coughing. At first it was light, almost harmless, but by nightfall the child's breath rasped with alarming strain. Clara pressed a hand to her fevered brow, her stomach sinking. Elias hovered nearby, his tough frame suddenly powerless, pacing the room like a caged animal. "She needs medicine," Clara said urgently. "Her chest is burning. It won't pass on its own. The town's 2 days' ride. Raiders prowl the trails." His fists clenched. "It's too dangerous." "Dangerous for me," Clara said, rising. But more dangerous for her if I stay. He stared at her, torn between pride and fear, but the truth shone in her steady gaze. She was already resolved. She packed water and bread, wrapped herself against the cold, and took the reins of Elias's spare horse. Annie stirred in her fever, whispering words too faint to catch. Clara leaned down and kissed her damp hair. "I'll come back," she promised, though her heart thudded with dread. The moon had not yet risen when she mounted and rode into the dark. The wind bit her cheeks, the earth drummed beneath hooves, and behind her the ranch shrank into shadow. The horizon seemed endless, and every rustle of brush carried the threat of eyes watching, waiting. Yet she pressed onward, each stride carrying her further into peril and deeper into the story that had claimed her the moment a little girl's hand tugged her skirt and whispered of God's deliverance. The trail stretched ahead like a ribbon of fate, and Clara knew there was no turning back. The wind cut like glass against Clara's cheeks as the horse pounded across the moonlit plain. Each breath of the night seemed sharpened, every sound magnified, the creak of leather, the drumming hooves, the wild thud of her own pulse. She bent low in the saddle, urging the animal faster, whispering desperate encouragements though her throat ached from dryness. Behind her, the ranch lay swallowed by distance, and ahead stretched miles of empty land where menace could hide in every fold of shadow. The first shot cracked through the air like lightning tearing the sky. Clara flinched, jerking the reins as the horse snorted and veered. She didn't look back, she didn't dare. The sound alone told her riders were following, hunters chasing prey. Her bonnet tore loose, whipped away into the night. She pressed closer to the horse's neck, whispering frantic prayers between gasps. More gunfire echoed, closer this time, the shot sparking against rocks near the trail. She pushed the horse toward a dry creek bed, the land dropping away in a sudden slope. Rocks tumbled under hooves, dust clouding the air. For one terrifying instant she thought they would fall, but the beast steadied, scrambling down into the hollow. The creek bed offered cover, its walls shielding her from direct fire. She urged forward, weaving between boulders, every muscle burning with fear-driven resolve. At last the sounds of pursuit dulled. She slowed the horse, straining to listen. Silence pressed heavy, broken only by the rasp of the animal's breath. Sweat slicked its neck, her hands ached from clinging to the reins. She slid down from the saddle, legs trembling, and pressed her ear against the canyon wall, waiting. Minutes stretched, her lungs tight as a noose. When no more hoofbits reached her, she mounted again and pressed on, guided by a sliver of stars. By dawn, her eyes burned from lack of sleep, but the small town finally rose from the dust. Weathered storefronts huddled along a single street, a church steeple leaning as if tired of reaching heaven. People stared as she rode in, dust-caked and wild-eyed, her dress torn, hair unpinned. Murmurs followed her like a tide. "That's the bride," one voice whispered. "Went to the wrong ranch," another muttered. She ignored them. Dismounting stiffly, she stumbled toward the doctor's office, a narrow building with peeling paint and a crooked sign. She pushed through the door, nearly collapsing against the counter. The doctor, a grey-bearded man with spectacles perched low, looked up in surprise. "Good Lord, woman! You ride through a storm." "My child," her voice cracked, then steadied with force. "She's burning with fever. She needs medicine now." He frowned. "Your child?" "Yes," Clara said without hesitation. "Mine." The lie sprang from instinct, but as it left her lips she realized it carried truth. Annie was hers now, at least in the only way that mattered. The doctor studied her, then grumbled as he gathered bottles and powders, muttering about scarcity, about how medicine couldn't work miracles. Clara snatched the satchel before he could finish, thrust coins into his hand, and turned back to the street without another word. The return ride was worse. Fatigue pulled at her limbs, and each sound seemed to carry threat. She kept the horse moving, whispering Annie's name like a beacon, each repetition driving her forward. Twice she thought she saw riders in the distance, black shapes against the horizon, but they did not give chase. Still, she kept her hand near Elias's pistol tucked at her side, though the weight of it frightened her. When at last the cabin came into sight, her vision blurred with tears she hadn't realized she was holding back. She slid from the saddle and stumbled through the door, the satchel clutched to her chest. Elias rose from Annie's bedside at the sight of her, his eyes wide with disbelief. "You came back," he said, as if the words tasted foreign. Clara ignored him, rushing to Annie, who lay pale and trembling, her breath shallow as the tide's last pull. Clara's hands shook as she measured the dose, lifted the child carefully, and coaxed the medicine past cracked lips. Then she sat, rocking Annie gently, whispering songs her own mother had sung long ago. Elias watched, his fists opening and closing uselessly, his strength meaningless against this quiet battle. The hours dragged like years. Elias paced the floor until the boards creaked underfoot. Clara never left Annie's side. She prayed in low murmurs, sometimes aloud, sometimes only in her heart, until her throat grew raw. Dawn spilled faint light through the shutters when Annie's breathing eased. The rasp softened, her forehead cooled beneath Clara's hand, and a flutter of color returned to her cheeks. The girl stirred, blinking weakly, and whispered, "God sent you." Mama asked him, and he did. Clara's throat tightened until she could not speak. Tears blurred her vision as she pressed her lips to Annie's temple. Across the room, Elias had stopped pacing. His face was turned toward them, eyes shadowed with something he could not hide, relief, yes, but also a crack in the armor he had worn for years. When Annie drifted into steadier sleep, Clara finally looked at him. Their gazes locked, unspoken truths hanging heavy. He opened his mouth as though to speak, then closed it, unable to shape the words. Instead, he turned to the window, shoulders rigid. Clara smoothed Annie's hair and leaned back against the wall, exhaustion pressing down but her spirit strangely alight. For the first time since she had set foot on this barren land, she felt she belonged, not because of a letter or an arrangement, but because a child's faith had bound her to this place. Outside, the morning was too quiet. The silence was not peace but a warning, as though the land itself held its breath. Clara felt it, and Elias must have felt it too, for he stayed by the window, eyes fixed on the horizon. Then, faint at first but growing louder, came the unmistakable rhythm of many hooves. Dust rose at the far line of the plain. Riders. This time not testing, not threatening, they were coming in force. Elias gripped his rifle, his jaw set. Clara drew Annie closer, her pulse quickening. The brief peace of the night shattered in an instant, replaced by the knowledge that everything they had fought to hold together might be torn apart come sunrise. The dust rose in a heavy curtain across the horizon, and with it came the thunder of hooves. Clara felt the sound deep in her bones before she saw the riders, a growing storm of men on horseback, rifles glinting in the morning sun. The air itself seemed to tremble beneath their charge. Annie stirred at the noise, half waking, and Clara pressed a hand over her hair, whispering reassurance though her own heart hammered like a war drum. Elias stood planted by the window, rifle braced, jaw hard as granite. "They mean to finish it this time," he said. His voice was steady, but the set of his shoulders betrayed the weight of what lay ahead. Clara rose, her skirts brushing the floor, and crossed to him. "Then we finish it too." His eyes flicked to her, startled, as if seeing her not as an intruder anymore but as a partner in the fate of this place. He handed her a box of cartridges without a word. Her fingers fumbled at first, but steadied quickly. She was no marksman, yet determination lent her strength. The first wave came hard. Shots cracked, windows shattered, and wood splintered under the barrage. Elias fired quick, measured volleys, each report answered by a scream or a curse outside. Clara loaded and handed rifles with frantic precision, ducking when bullets tore through the walls. Annie cried from the cellar below, the sound both a wound and a spur. The raiders circled, whooping to rattle nerves, then charged the gate. Elias cut two from their saddles, but more pushed forward, hurling torches. Flames licked along the dry fence, smoke curling into the wind. Clara seized a bucket, dashed the fire, choking on the acrid stench, while Elias shouted at her to stay down. She refused. Each small act of defiance bound her more tightly to the fight. When the door burst inward, it was Clara who moved first. She swung the rifle but against the raider's face, the crack of bone sharp as a whip. He dropped, blood spreading across the floorboards. Elias stared for half a heartbeat, astonished, before dropping another with a bullet clean through the chest. The fight spilled into the yard. Dust churned beneath stamping hooves, smoke burned the eyes, and the air rang with curses and gunfire. Clara stayed close to Elias, reloading as fast as her hands allowed. Once, when a raider crept behind him, she seized Elias's pistol and fired. The recoil nearly threw her backward, but the man fell, and Elias turned in time to see her standing with the smoking gun. "Damnation," he muttered, half to himself. "You've got steel in you." Her answer came in short breaths. "I didn't ride all this way to die quiet." But fate was merciless. A shot caught Elias across the side, spinning him down into the dirt. Clara screamed his name, dropping beside him, her hands slick with blood. His teeth clenched against the pain, but his eyes blazed. "Don't stop. Don't you dare stop." Rage steadied her. She dragged him behind the trough, pressed her shawl against the wound, and rose again with his rifle braced against her shoulder. Her shot rang out wild but true enough to drive the raiders back from the porch. She fired again, and again, the world narrowing into smoke, heat, and the thunder of her heart. At last, the leader shouted a retreat. The surviving riders wheeled, dragging their wounded, vanishing into the desert like phantoms. The ranch fell silent but for the crackle of dying flames and the ragged pull of breath. Clara dropped the rifle and knelt at Elias's side. His face was pale, lips drawn thin, yet he was alive. She pressed his hand in hers, refusing to release it. Annie's small figure emerged from the cellar, eyes wide with fear and hope. She ran to Clara, clinging tight, and in that embrace the battle's fury melted into trembling relief. Later, when the fires were smothered and the dead dragged aside, Clara tended Elias's wound by lantern light. His voice was rough, but each word deliberate. "I thought this place was finished. Thought I was finished with it. Then you came, out of nowhere, unasked for, and stood your ground." Clara rinsed the blood from her hands, her voice quiet but firm. "Perhaps I was sent to the wrong ranch. But it feels less wrong now." Annie curled close to Clara's side, eyes half closed, murmuring through sleep, "Mama said God would send someone." And he did. Elias turned his face toward them, pain shadowing his expression yet unable to dim the flicker of warmth that broke through. He reached for Clara's hand, clasping it despite the bandages and the weariness. "Stay," he said simply, the word heavy with meaning. Not an order, not an obligation, an invitation. Clara's throat tightened. She looked at the man who had first told her to leave, the man now leaning on her for life itself, and then at the child who clung to her with unshakable trust. She felt the weight of her journey, the scars of her past, and the fragile promise of tomorrow all at once. The night deepened outside, but within the cabin, something had shifted. No longer strangers thrown together by error, they were a family forged by fire and blood. Clara whispered a prayer she had not known she still remembered, giving thanks not for safety, but for purpose. And when the silence grew full and still, the narrator's voice seemed to rise from the dust and smoke. "Sometimes the wrong road leads to the only home we were ever meant to find. Sometimes the wrong ranch is exactly where God intended us to stand." If this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments.